Okay, in this part of the tutorial I'm just going to show you how to handle the text input and kind of modify it, do something with it. So we're going to perform some kind of a function with our text input. We're going to create this function that's basically just going to double the input number. So the user will be forced to enter some number or some kind of input as a number. We'll take that input, convert it to a double, then perform this double function, which is just going to take our number and double it, and then we'll display it as the label text. And in this way we're kind of modifying the input text a little bit and performing some kind of action on it. And yeah, so I'm just kind of showing you how to do different stuff with your text input. Okay, so now we've seen how to take text as an input and display it in two ways. So we used a button to display the text, and we used the phone keyboard and the return key to display the text. Okay, so that's just taking the input and displaying it. Now we're going to do some other stuff with the text input. Rather than just spitting it right out, we're going to modify it a bit and then display it. So this has very many useful applications, and the first one that comes to mind, for me at least, is kind of calculator applications. So we're going to need to take in some kind of a text, perform some kind of calculation, and then spit out a result. So what we're going to do is we're going to just go ahead and we're going to ignore this stuff for now. The text field should return, and the text field did end editing. And we're going to focus mostly on the press button action function. For now, I'm just going to comment out this line because this is no longer what I want to have happen. I want to take in the text input, so let's say, and store it as a variable. So we're going to have a variable, I'm just going to call this text input, and we're going to say the C equal to txt text field dot text. And I'm just going to add in the exclamation mark there, just to make sure that this variable will always have some kind of text input. Okay, so again, this is a good idea if you want to have something that's always going to have some kind of an input. So if you will always need input, and include this exclamation mark every time. Sometimes if you don't, then it gives you an error. And this is just saying it was never used, consider replacing it with something or removing it. And that's fine, we're going to be using it in a minute anyway. So I didn't want that to have happen. I'm just going to click back on these, and that brings us back to the two screens we had open. Okay, so we're not really going to focus on view controller for now. I'm just going to kind of minimize that a little bit. We're only going to look at we're not going to look at main.storyboard, we're going to look at the view controller.swift. Okay, so we have this variable text input, and it's going to be equal to basically whatever kind of text is inputted in here. Now what we want is we want this variable to, in this case, be a number. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to modify this a little bit. In fact, I'm just going to create a new variable altogether. I'm going to call this variable number input, and I'm going to have this equal to a double version of the text field, text. So what this is doing is it's taking our text field text, it's converting it to a double, because remember, it's going to be a string. It will always be represented as a string, so we're converting it to a double, and we're storing it in this number input variable. Now, what do we want to do with this? Well, let's just have some kind of function that doubles whatever number we give it. So let's create this now. We'll call this function double number. And it's just going to take in a double, which is going to be a number. We're going to have this called number, going to be of type double. And should we have it display? Nah, let's not have it return anything. We'll create another function for that. So what we're going to do is this is just going to take in our number, and it's going to, in fact, yeah, let's have this return a double. And this is just going to say, it's going to basically return number times 2. So all it's doing is it's taking in our input number, multiplying it by 2, and returning it. Okay. And what we're going to do is we're going to create this other variable called doubled number, and it's going to be equal to double number called on the number of number input. Okay, and then the last thing we're going to do, I see that, well, we should include the exclamation mark there. And the last thing we're going to do is we're just going to have this print, so we're going to have LBL label.text is equal to doubled number, and that should be a string representation of doubled number. Geez, I cannot type today. Okay. Doubled number. Okay, so let's talk about what's going on here. So the first line is just creating this variable. It's called number input, and it's going to be equal to our text field text converted to a double. Again, it has to have some kind of a text, which is why we have the exclamation mark. So number input is just going to contain some kind of a number that we're inputting into here. And basically, we're then going to create this variable called double number, and it's going to be the result of this function call on our number input. So we're inputting this, we have this number input, let's say we put in 5.5. We are then passing it into double number, and double number is just going to take 5.5 and it's going to return 5.5 times 2, which should be 11. It's just going to return it and store it in this variable doubled number, and then our label text is just going to be the string representation of doubled number. So let's go ahead and see this running. And this is just to kind of give you an idea of some of the stuff that you can do with the text input. So this will be particularly useful for any calculator apps, and we will make some calculator apps. You'll see that this will be very useful, or very useful skill to be able to have. And we're going to open up the simulator, and here we go. So let's just enter in some kind of a number, and the keyboard's coming up. That's fine. In fact, no, that's not fine. What we're going to do is we're going to go hardware, we're going to go keyboard, and I'm just going to connect the hardware keyboard so that I can type stuff freely. So we enter in some kind of a number here, let's say 6.6, and there we get 13.2 being displayed. And so again, just to walk through the steps as to why we get 13.2, we've commented out the previous button function, which was just kind of creating or just passing in the text field text. We're now creating this variable called double number. It's going to be our, or the variable, first one is the number input, and it's just going to be whatever number we input here, so in this case 6.6. We're going to pass it into the function double number, which is just going to take our input number and times it by 2. In this case, that should be 13.2. It's then going to store it in this variable double number and assign that to be the text of our label. Okay, so that's all that's going on. So it's just taking our number, doubling it, and displaying it as our label text. Okay, so we know everything's working fine, and that's just one example of the many things you can do with these text inputs. So basically, if you're taking in text input, I think one of the most important things to note is going to be how the number is or how your input is taken in. So remember, it's always going to be a string. No matter what, your input will always default to be a string, and your output should always be a string as well. That being said, you can then convert your input. In this case, I converted my string input into a double, but that also means that I can only accept double input or I can only accept doubles as my input text. Okay, so be careful about stuff like that. You might want to, in these kind of cases, you might want to write kind of exceptions to handle if your input is not a double. Okay, so this was just one of the many things that you can do. I showed you a simple example, taking a number input, doubling it, and then displaying it once a button is pressed. But yeah, so take this and expand on it, try out some new ideas before moving on to the next part, because the next part will just be kind of how to modify the properties of your text input or of your text field itself. Okay, so in this part we just performed some kind of function with our text input. So we took our input, converted it to a double, then we performed this double function which just doubled our number, and then we converted it back to a string and set it equal to the label text with that same label lbl label.text equals and then the value we want. This time we had to convert it back to a string, however. So this was just an example of one of the many things we can do with input texts. It's very common that we'll take in some kind of an input and store it as a variable. So if the input's always as a string, bear in mind, and the output always has to be as a string as well. So if you're outputting something, if you're assigning text, convert it to a string first. If you're taking in text, make sure it's in the form you want by converting it as necessary. So in our case, we needed to take our input text and convert it to a double from a string. Okay? So this has just been how to kind of take in text input, store it in variables, handle it, and do something different with it rather than just displaying it right away.